China calls for cooperation from the United States on the 40th anniversary of diplomatic ties between the two countries. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Chinese President Xi Jinping sent US President Donald Trump a congratulatory message marking 40 years since Beijing and Washington established diplomatic ties. President Xi said history has proved that cooperation is the best choice for both sides. Trump said his priority is to promote cooperative and constructive US-China relations. The leaders also spoke by telephone over the weekend as trade delegations prepare to meet in Beijing next week in hopes of ending the trade dispute. China is urging the United States to be objective.
中国古代的圣贤孔子曾经说过40.
Ancient Chinese philosopher Confucius observed that when reaching the age of 40, one should have no more doubts. If the past 4 momentous decades of China-U.S. engagement were any guide, it boils down to the conclusion that our two countries stand to gain from cooperation and lose from confrontation.
Well, we have much to discuss. Let's bring in our panel. Here with us in the studio is Nicolas Veron. He is a senior fellow with the Peterson Institute for International Economics. From Shanghai, Pingkang is the chief economist at Changjiang Pension Insurance. Jonathan Broder is a senior writer with Newsweek based right here in Washington, D.C. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Pingkang, let me start with you in Shanghai. You know, as we've been reporting, this year marks the 40th anniversary of the normalization or the restoration of relations between China and the United States. But it is being overshadowed by this escalating trade war between Washington and Beijing. So what do you see as the prospects for some kind of resolution taking place in 2019?
Well, I have to say that my answer will be cautiously optimistic. Well, to be optimistic because this is a common ground that both countries can seek. Trade could be mutually beneficial. Even though there are arguments from both sides, from the United States side, there are arguments about intellectual property, right protection, etc., and market access, etc. But remember, these are the issues that the Chinese government also have key interest to work on. As China has registered as for 5 consecutive years as a country that produced most patents in the world. And from the Chinese side, the argument is about these restrictions of these exports of high-tech products from the United States to China and to the whole world. So I think that there are arguments from both sides, but as long as we can seek the common ground, the issues could be resolved. But then, we also have to respect the differences because two countries have different systems of government, and neither country can dictate to other country how the government should govern. And then, as long as we can contain the trade talks to trade issues per se, I think that, the prospect could be optimistic.
Okay, well, we also have joining us now from Beijing, Zhao Hai. He's a research fellow with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Welcome to you, sir. As we've said, on this 40th anniversary of China-U.S. relations being restored, diplomatic relations, President Xi Jinping said, history has proved that cooperation is the best choice for both sides. What is your view on this? Are you optimistic? Will these two countries find a way to move forward to improve bilateral relations?
Yeah, I think in the long run, I'm always optimistic because U.S.-China relations has been experiencing up and downs for years. The relationship is not consistently stable. There are difficulties in our bilateral relations, but there are also fundamentals between our two relations. So I think in the short run, we may experience turbulence and some kind of difficulties, but through negotiation and because we have so much shared common interest, in the long run, I think this relationship will be stable and the cooperation will be the main theme of this bilateral relationship.
Jonathan, there was an interesting piece in the Washington Post today. It was by former President Jimmy Carter. And of course, Jimmy Carter played a key role in the restoration of diplomatic relations. It was Carter and Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese leader at the time, who restored relations. Well, in this piece in the Washington Post, he talked about what can be done to repair this relationship. I'm going to read a little bit of what he said. He said, neither country should use national security as an excuse to obstruct the other's legitimate commercial activities. China needs competition for its economy to innovate and grow. Pursuing a fair and reciprocal relationship is the only way for both countries to remain economically strong. You know, there's all kinds of viewpoints on why this relationship went south. Is this about trade imbalances and intellectual property, or is it about containing China?
It's about both. I mean, I would argue that that even if the United States and China do resolve, or at least find some temporary way to paper over their differences over trade, there will remain the larger issue of the threat that the United States perceives of a rising China, challenging the dominant U.S. role in the world. And that is not going to end with resolution of trade differences. I would also add that resolving the trade differences is not going to be that easy. There are two camps within the administration. One is, I would say, led by the Treasury Secretary, who's more moderate, Stephen Mnuchin, and would like to see a resolution of this. And then you have ideological folks in the U.S. Trade Representatives camp, and they are the ones who are leading the negotiations. And they're pretty hard line on this kind of stuff.
When you say you don't expect to see these tensions end pretty soon, I mean, are we going to see a prolonged period of confrontation between these two countries?
I think if you look back at the speech that the Vice President gave in October to the Hudson Institute, Vice President Pence, that was a very bluntly worded, tough speech. And it augured, in the view of many, sort of a new Cold War between the United States and China. Because, as you know, there's more than just trade. There's issues of South China Sea, U.S. fears over the real purpose of the Belt and Road Initiative. So there are a lot of strategic issues as well.
Okay. Nicolas, of course, the rest of the world will be watching this very closely. I mean, we're talking about the world's biggest economy and the world's second biggest economy here being at loggerheads with each other. What kind of impact will it have on the rest of the world if this confrontation continues?
Well, first, the confrontation and the broader issue of the Trump trade policy already has impact. We're seeing the stock markets very nervous. We're seeing lower growth in the world, lower investment. And this is, attribution is always difficult, but it's pretty clear now that the Trump administration's trade policy has a negative impact on global growth, global investment, and capital markets. So this is not future, this is present. Now, the confrontation between the US and China is a matter, because the US and China are the world's two biggest economies, it's a matter of interest for every country in the world. There is no, as Jimmy Carter eloquently put it in his op-ed, there is no reasonable alternative to cooperation between the US and China. But it's not clear at this point that the US would be reasonable. And one thing that every country in the world doesn't want to have to do, maybe not every country in the world, but most countries, including Europe, including Japan, including African, Latin American countries, is having to choose between the US and China. So countries around the world are trying to delay the moment when they would have to take sides in this growing confrontation. They hope that the confrontation will go away. Given the nature of the Trump administration, it's difficult to be comfortable about that.
Right, Nicolas, you talked a moment ago about the fact that US markets have been unstable because of this continuing trade friction with China. So the pressure is also on the US to reach some kind of settlement quickly, isn't it?
It depends how much administration is sensitive to this pressure from markets. Yeah. And by the way, I don't think that the market concern is only about the US-China trade relationship. It's more broadly about the trade policy of the Trump administration. Because as you know, the Trump administration has fired on all cylinders in all directions. There is a fragile truce with the European Union, but it has been aggressively protectionist in a number of different dimensions: steel, aluminum, cars, the renegotiation of NAFTA, the ongoing negotiation with Japan. So it's not just US-China, even so US-China is the defining relationship.
Right. Zhao Hai, I want to get your view on what Jonathan Broder just told us a moment ago, that this is not just about trade, it goes beyond that. The United States, in a sense, wants to contain China.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a multidimensional problem between the two countries. Also wanted to go back to President Carter's piece in Washington Post. Before you mentioned both countries should not use national security as an excuse on trade. But he also mentioned that there are misperceptions and also miscalculations that could lead to military confrontation and wars. So I think in these two relationships right now, it's important to interpret each other's intentions in a correct way instead of misinterpret each other's intentions, and particularly in terms of strategic intentions about China concerning the surrounding areas, geopolitics, and also areas between cyber and space. So I think it's very important both sides keep communication, particularly on the top leadership in terms of presidential talks. So I think communication right now is very important. And beyond that, negotiation teams need to resolve technical problems.
Zhao Hai, I'm wondering what the risks are here if these two sides don't get a settlement soon. There was a piece written in USA Today, the American newspaper, by China's ambassador to the United States, Xu Tiankai. He wrote this opinion piece in which he said the steady growth of China-US relations is indispensable to the success of our two countries and the world as air and water to live. It would be irresponsible and detrimental for us to decouple or become isolated from each other. I mean, is there a danger of that happening, Zhao Hai, that these countries could become isolated from each other?
Yeah. I think there's a real danger that if the U.S. side continue down this road, there is a real possibility that the industries in both countries will be forced to delink to a larger extent than currently that both enjoyed. So I think it's a very important thing to bear in mind for both sides, that we should continue to negotiate and reach a, both sides could satisfy terms.
Right.
So I think our ambassador to the U.S. has made it very clear that if we don't do that, not only bilateral relations will suffer, but also global governance is in danger, because without China's participation or U.S. participation, none of the international organizations will work.
Right. You, Pingkang, you wanted to say something there? Did you want to say?
Right.
Go
trade
ahead.
has always been a politically contentious issue. Right. Because it's really, there's no absolutely fair trade, depending on what way you're looking at. One party gain a little bit more, one party gain a little bit less. But as long as both parties can gain from a trade, then the deal can continue. So that means we cannot attach too much political kind of price tag to the economic issues. So I think that as long as the both parties can realize this point, and as long as the people in both countries can realize the trade can be hugely beneficial to both countries, I think that eventually this trade dispute will go away.
Right, Yu Pingkang, I'm wondering under how much pressure China finds itself right now. I mean, the economy in China has slowed down. In fact, the latest IMF growth projection for China is 6.2% for 2019. And in that report, the IMF cites the trade war as being one of the reasons for this lower growth estimate. So how is the dispute hurting China's economy right now?
Right. But the China is facing a tremendous, downward pressure in terms of economic growth. But trade is only one factor, and most likely it's not a major factor because the economic, downward pressure usually largely comes from the factor of business cycle rather than external factor, because the net exports only represents a small share to the GDP growth rate in China right now. And also, if there's there's a negative kind of shock, a negative shock to this Chinese economy, external shock to the Chinese economy, then with this kind of import substitution effect will be characterized in economics, with this import substitution taking place, then this effect could be minimized. And as well, and also another point is that the Chinese government is also trying to introduce some stimulus package, particularly sort of a fiscal reform, such as tax cuts, etc. And if this trade dispute can let the Chinese government to realize the importance of conducting internal reform, particularly such as these fiscal reform, SOE reform, etc., then this will largely offset the negative impact of international trade.
Right, Nicolas, in his New Year's speech to the nation, the Chinese President Xi Jinping, he talked about some of the challenges, some of the risks that China faces in the year ahead. Let's listen to part of what he had to say.
Looking at the world at large, we're facing a period of major change, not seen in 100 years. No matter what these changes bring, China will remain resolute and confident in the defense of its national sovereignty and security, and China's sincerity and goodwill to safeguard world peace and promote common development will remain unchanged.
So, Nicolas, what are the major challenges or risks that China faces right now, in your view?
I think the point that was made just before by Mr. Yu is very important. By reforming its economy, supply-side structural reform, as the Chinese debate has it, China can enhance its growth potential, its long-term growth potential, so not just on the short-term basis. If it's able to do that, to overcome the political obstacles to such reforms, which everybody knows are very significant, then there is a very favorable long-term horizon for Chinese growth. So these are basically domestic issues. And if the Chinese government manages to leverage the pressures that comes from the Trump administration and the trade war to unlock that kind of reforms, then the net effect, long-term effect, and also medium-term for the Chinese economy could actually be very positive. My colleague at the Peterson Institute, Nick Lardy, has developed that analysis in, I think, a very compelling way, that the Chinese growth potential over a long-term period going forward can be about as high as it has been in the recent few decades, but on the very important conditions that they overcome the political obstacles against structural reform.
Jonathan, if we look at current China policy on the part of the United States, it's been driven largely by the White House. As you've pointed out, there is a moderate faction and there's a hardline faction. But what is the thinking among the American business community and the foreign policy establishment here?
The business community, particularly the business community that's based in China, feels that they are excluded from certain markets, particularly financial services, that even when China agrees to liberalize rules that would prevent American firms from entering into these markets, that China constructs other let's say, licensing difficulties that prevent them from coming in. So I would say that the business community and Trump, at least on the issue of American penetration into the Chinese market, are on the same page. If you then turn to the domestic businesses in the United States, for example, farming, they are not happy with this trade war. They're being hurt very, very badly. The U.S. agricultural sector was already hurting tremendously before the trade war began, and now that there's the trade difficulties, they're being hurt even worse. So it's a bit of a mixed picture.
Zhao Hai, there was a piece in today's South China Morning Post, the newspaper that's based in Hong Kong, in which they interviewed a former United States trade negotiator, Charlene Bashevsky, and she played a key role, actually, in China's accession to the WTO. And she says that inaction by previous U.S. administrations has led to the current impasse. She says China has been backsliding on market reforms, and Beijing has adopted an economic model that is significantly state-run and unfair to foreign companies. What do you make of that criticism?
Well, I think what happened after 2008 is the problem with American policy that impacted China's economy and the difficulties caused by these external factors, but also caused by China's internal business cycle as well as economic gear change, combined together have influenced China's recent rhythm of domestic reform. So I think overall, at this point, the changing external factors and also changing domestic factors will contribute more to the further reform within China and further opening up that President Xi has promised in his speech. So I think moving forward, we should be cautiously optimistic about the next stage of China's domestic reform and opening up. She said something about the back steps. Some of that probably true, but what I'm saying is that the factor contributing to that is really complicated. It's not just political, but also there are important economic factors to consider. Right now, I think the government is not really concerned about the growth rate. The central issue is how to move China's economy to a high-quality economic growth. And that's the central concern. And as long as the U.S. considering that China's moving up the value chain is a threat to U.S. national security, then we have a problem. We need to communicate on that front.
You, Pingkang, when you hear this kind of criticism, as I've just quoted from Charlene Bashevsky in the South China Morning Post, things like, the Chinese economy is still significantly state-run, that China is unfair to foreign companies. I mean, these are calls being made here by the United States for change. How does China meet those calls?
Well, we have to realize that the Chinese government has conducted this structural reform since the fourth quarter of 2015. So it's already been going on for 3 years. And then, we always hear about the criticism on this issue, on that issue, etc. But we have to realize that during the economic downturn, in the business cycle, any country, into this downturn business cycle, really is going through this process, what we call the destructive, creative destruction. So, at the destruction side, there are always loud cries, right? There's some kind of arguments from the old industry, from different aspects in the economy. But at the creative side, there are actually a range of new industries has risen up, such as artificial intelligence, such as internet plus services, etc. And so we have to, if we want to look at the dynamics and the vibrance of the economy, we have to pay a closer look from the different industries rather than pointing fingers at the aggregate levels.
Nicolas, let's look at one of the big issues.
I think that, overall,
go ahead.
In terms of reform.
Go ahead.
Right. So overall, I think that the reform is still going on, and from the speech of the President Xi delivered on the New Year's Eve, we can also see that there are a range of issues that the Chinese government is trying to work on. Actually, the international kind of trade dispute actually strengthened the government's determination to further conduct economic reform. And also, there are also a number of other important issues, such as environmental protection, poverty alleviation, etc. So I think that there's a full, list on the reform agenda. In the coming years.
Nicolas, if we look at one of the big issues between the two countries, pretty much at the top of the agenda, market access. What are the stumbling blocks? Do you see any progress being made in the short term?
I think the U.S. debate is full of contradictions. There are contradictions in the administration between the more technical negotiators led by the trade representative, which are very focused on issues of the market access, intellectual property theft, requirements for joint ventures, things for U.S. companies operating in China. Compared with the president, which on the basis of his public expression just wants those companies to leave China, come back to the US, create jobs in the US, and forget about investment in China. So these are two different agendas. And it's very unclear that the president himself, who at the end of the day sets policy, has any sympathy with the agendas that the US businesses in China, as we were reminded, tries to push, which is about market access and what the Chinese authorities themselves currently call competitive neutrality. I think that progress that is being made in China doesn't get a lot of recognition in the US. If you look, for example, at intellectual property enforcement, China has centralized the court system for intellectual property enforcement, which is a huge improvement on the previous situation where provincial courts were captured by local authorities, which were developing local industrial policies for their local champions. This is almost unknown in the US. Now there's this emphasis in the public discourse, and we're starting to see that implemented in actual regulation on competitive neutrality. This is very important. This is of the same order of magnitude as competition policy in the European Union, for example. It will take a lot of time to deliver on the promise of competitive neutrality between state-owned firms, private firms in China, foreign-owned firms in China. But this high-level commitment from the authorities is extremely important. Nobody in the US talks about it. So I think, I don't want to sugarcoat the problems in China. We know the bad treatment of religious minorities, all that. But I think when there is a progress in China, it has to be recognized also in the US debate.
Okay. Jonathan, I want to get to something else. You know, we talked about this very briefly at the beginning of the program, and that is the diplomatic relationship between the United States and China. You know, they may have differences in trade, but they also need each other, don't they? When you think about things like some of the major challenges that the world faces right now, you know, the fighting terrorism, climate change, the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue. Don't they need each other there?
I would say that they need each other on Korea, and they need each other, one would hope, on climate change, but the Trump administration's policy on climate change is very, very similar to what you were describing on how Trump would prefer American companies to leave China, come back and start manufacturing in the United States. The U.S. has pulled out of the Paris Accords. So the opportunity there for cooperation on climate change, I think, is missing. But I think the biggest issue would be North Korea.
But, you know, if we take an issue like climate change, I mean, that is the situation now. It could change after the next election, couldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. But the question, of course, always is how much damage gets done between now and then. Another area where there could be cooperation, but again, where the United States is pulling out, is in the reconstruction of Syria.
Right.
I was talking with Chinese officials on this, and the Belt and Road Initiative, which is building infrastructure across the developing world, Syria is a prime target for the Belt and Road, which is a wonderful thing, I think. I mean, who else has the money to rebuild Syria if not China?
Yep. Zhao Hai, very quickly, I've got about 40 seconds left. President Trump said on the last day of 2018, that's the 31st of December, he said there is, quote, big progress in talks with the Chinese President Xi Jinping. Do you share the US President's optimistic outlook?
Yes, I think so. I think if you look at what China has been doing and has done so far, it's really satisfactory to, I think, President Trump, the purchase, the reforms. And going forward, China will do more, and expecting the US to reciprocate.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.